And we are now live.
Uh, if you don't mind, can you hide the camera too?
Sure, sure.
My face. It's so horrible. He's so
If you don't
ugly.
mind, can you hide the camera too?
Oh shit, why am I hearing?
My face.
I heard a little bit of feedback. I didn't know. I don't know what that was because I do have it muted on my end the stream.
It was my other computer where I have the other chats pulled up just in case it doesn't show up in the restream chat.
Gotcha, gotcha.
I muted it.
Cool. I think this is all good. Let me make sure I turned off my stove.
Just in case,
Guess I should probably go ahead and share the stream, people. That might be smart.
All right, I'm back. Sorry about that.
No problem. Alright, got everything showing up here except for the chat for some reason. Oh, that's why. There we go. So now people chats will be able to see the chat itself here in the right hand corner of the screen. If I can extend it. There we go. Edit transform. There we go. I see your chat message calling Amir a hobo.
He's such a hobo.
All right, so 440, I believe, and then I want this to be about 500. 700. A little stretch, but that's fine. All right, there. Now we should see when people want to chat. There we go. Okay, so the name of the game with this stream today is to basically have a little debate around framework documentation with DragonRuby.
Yay! Hooray! So what do you think of that, like the guidelines for Discord kind of thing?
Not bad at all. Let me see. Do I still have that up? No, I don't.
I mean, it might be a good idea to kind of like explain some of it.
Yeah, that probably would be good. Let me see. The gist. There it is. Okay, so guidelines for dialogue.
Let me get it on my screen too. Oh, okay, you brought it in. Cool. All right.
So, debate in a way that's not evoking emotion with other people. So, general terms, I agree, disagree, don't understand, confused, abstain, you are uninformed, misinformed, illogical, biases, playing preference ping pong, and what of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I abstain means you want to do more research into something before commenting
Right.
on it.
Right, and the premise is that with each one of these like replies, there's got to be a reason, right? Like if you say I abstain, but then don't explain why you're abstaining or what you want to research, then it's kind of like, well, what's unclear? What do you want to research, right?
Right.
And so the other thing is like there's an I agree and I disagree, and eventually we'll kind of converge on, you know, being accurate with when we're saying I agree or disagree. But you can always challenge someone to say, okay, well, you're saying in either way, like if someone says I agree, you can still ask them like, well, do you really understand what I said? And the way you can the way you reply to that when someone says, do you really understand? What I'm then tasked to do is paraphrase what you said and then exemplify it in some way. So provide an example, like a concrete real world example, demonstrating some specific thing,
Right.
right? So like something with IntelliSense. Let's say you explain something with IntelliSense, and I go, I say I disagree. Well, before you might say, well, can you explain to me, like, can you make sure, I want to make sure you understood what I said. So then I'd have to paraphrase what you said in my own way and then see if I can provide a real world example to it. So you can do that on either the agreeing or disagreeing side. And then I abstain basically says, well, I'm not sure. Here's what I want to research. We can come back to this at some future point in time.
Right.
So, and then I don't understand. That's either that ends up being either a failure of the explainer or a limitation in how much knowledge the person has, and then they try to figure out what was not understood, and then keep talking about it.
Right. And then of course there's bias, which is basically just
I don't know. I don't understand what you said, but I don't like it. Right? It's like, whoa, wait, hold on.
Exactly.
Wait just a second.
Yeah. Preference ping pong is basically just, well, it's my preference, and that's what I choose to do. Like, I prefer using an IDE like Visual Studio or IntelliJ. You prefer using them.
Right. And so with these debates, and this is something I left out of like the guidelines for Discord, is that before starting this debate, there has to be like an agreed upon thesis. In that, and for me, that thesis is contextual to this debate would be, there is a objectively perfect and ideal way of doing API documentation. It may take a lifetime to figure out. There might be many like parameters that inform that specific decision on how to do documentation, but there is an air quotes truth to the perfect way to do documentation objectively. And so you start with that thesis and say, this debate isn't about winning or losing. It's getting closer to that objective truth that we're both trying, we're both practitioners for and value in trying to find. So then because of that, because there's this, if we can both agree that there's objective truth to the perfect way to do documentation, there is no preference then. It's not preference ping pong. There has to be an answer. We just have to find it. And so when someone says, well, just my preference, and at the same time it was agreed upon that there was like that top level thesis, well, then there's some bias and they're not wanting to admit one thing or the other, right? And the other thing is that there's always a gap in knowledge, right? So when you say I agree, when someone says I agree, they're saying I'm going to update my mental model to include what you said, such that in the future when we speak again, we can both improve again, right? So it's not it's saying like I've leveled up, and we both like learned something from this, and then we're both closer to that final thesis.
Right.
And I think that part is important. But the moment you say it's just preference, it's like game over, right?
Absolutely.
And so I call that preference ping pong. And another one is what of it. So an example is it's kind of like, how much do I care about this? Maybe coming in, someone thought that they really cared about this, and then suddenly they find that they didn't care about it or didn't want to put in the effort that they wanted to. They're like, okay, I'm going to bow out. So that's kind of like the bow out, or like, look, obviously I don't seem to value this as much as this other person does. At that point, I'm going to defer and kind of just listen to this other person and see what they say, and that's okay, right? Anyone tries to debate me on cooking, I'd be like, you're the boss. I know how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. If you're telling me that the way I'm making my grilled cheese sandwich is wrong, I will abstain and say, look, I definitely don't have a horse in this race. I'm out.
Yeah. All right. So Now, let's get into the meat of everything, which is
Mhm.
actually the framework documentation.
Yes. It's
So,
horrible, isn't it?
the current
It's the
documentation
worst.
could be
Okay, so
better.
can we first agree that there is definitely an objective, perfect way to document a framework? We're both still trying to discover it throughout our, career and lifetime, but there's definitely an objective way to do a framework documentation.
Yes, there is.
Cool.
So, here we go. So this is the current documentation that you have out, which is on the itch page, and it basically talks about a few of the primitives.
Hmm.
And then you have comments there saying, okay, this is how you draw a red label, blue square that's halfway faded out, things of that nature.
I'm just writing this down inside of like the CoderPath stuff. Like, so yeah, we started talking about uh, the landing page.
Yeah. So for me, while this is a good starting point,
Hmm.
documentation is more, okay, this is something that's shipped with the engine or an actual web page that you can search through, okay, drawing, and it'll take you to solids, labels, lines, things
Hmm.
like that. And then you can see the actual specification of how you're supposed to build it, whether it's a few parameters or all the parameters.
Right. So I agree with you with regards to the landing page. So where I had like draw a blue square that's half faded out. Um, I need to add something that tells you that 100 is X, like just another comment that says like 100 is X, the next 100 is Y, the next 50 is width, height, RGB, and then alpha, right?
Right.
Um, this is an enhancement that I can make to clean up and show you this is how you make, this is how you make a square, and these are what these ordinal positions look like. Same thing with label, same thing with sprite, same thing with diagonal green line, black border, and then sound.
Yeah, I should probably also pull up IntelliJ so that way we can also reference the samples as well.
Yes. So yes, coming to this page, that's definitely an enhancement. I also don't like that it's not syntax highlighted. We're working on that new website deployment, so a lot of that's going to hopefully be cleaned up, and we'll get some nice syntax highlighting and everything.
So let's see, we were talking about lines, so let's go to the main RD of lines. There we go.
All right. So the next piece, and so you're right. So there's an aspect of documentation where you're like, I want to evaluate this framework to see what it can do.
Right.
Okay. And so there's only because of NDAs, there's only a limited amount of information that I can put on the website. So up front, I made a decision to say, okay, one, the documentation that the documentation has to exist in the zip, meaning that when you download that version of the zip, that specific documentation is synchronized with that zip file. And then if you have, if there's NDA documentation, that NDA documentation would be in there too.
Right.
So when you go to the website, what I'm observing is that, just so I understand, you're evaluating it from the perspective of what can this thing do?
Correct.
Okay.
So
So then the question now is, how should the documentation be organized so that you can see what this thing does, and is there a better way? Is there a better way to demonstrate that this, and it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily worried about what this thing can do, or correct me if I'm wrong. You may not necessarily be worried about what this thing can do, but whether it can do the thing you want it to do.
no, that's actually a good summarization. Like, okay,
Right.
can I make it do what I want it to do?
Right. So like an example would be like, do you want to make a roguelike? So yeah, you can peruse the documentation to see if it has the things to make a roguelike, or there could have just been a showcase that shows you, look, this is a roguelike. You can make a roguelike similar to Into the Breach. Right? So like there's like the isometric, so Into the Breach is an awesome game if you haven't played it, but the isometric sample app would be an example of that.
Which would be this guy right here.
Yeah. So one of the to-dos I have on my list is to actually run all these sample apps and then just create an animated GIF for each one to show like the capabilities of the engine.
That's also good, but let's go with traditional style documentation. So if we were to look at, say, um, MSDN.
Perfect. That's a good idea.
MSDN C#. There we go. So if we look at the programming guide.
Let's bring up string.
String. That should be.
Just so you know, this isn't my first rodeo, so all my questions are loaded. Just full disclosure. Full disclosure. All my questions are loaded questions.
Okay, so here we go. Create an interpolated string. The first thing
Or
that
just
came up.
system.string, right?
Oh, system.string. Okay.
We want to look at system. The official MSDN API.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've actually looked at the API. There we go. Strings.
So something to observe. You're having a very hard time finding it, right? And this is what I fear too myself, is that it's so frustrating finding. All right, we got it. Cool. System.string. Perfect.
Yeah, it's just been a while since I've actually had to look up the official documentation on anything.
Yes. No, and I completely understand. So, okay, so let's look at this documentation. I think the explanation at the top is good. A string is an object of type string whose value is text. Internally, the text is stored as a sequential read-only collection of chars. See, I don't like that line because
It assumes that you have knowledge of what a char is.
and what a sequential read-only collection is, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no null terminating character, same deal. String info, what the hell is that, right? So the challenge with reference documentation the way it exists today is it's ordered alphabetically. So an example, if you like scroll through the functions,
So like declare without
like if you scroll down,
initialization,
yep.
or are you
Keep
talking
going,
about
keep going.
readability?
So I like this right here, like the examples right here. The examples are great.
Oh, with the string escape sequences?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
I think I have a delay of like probably like 15. Actually, do you think you can share do a screen share on your on G Plus so I'm like in sync with you instead of you looking at the stream?
Yeah.
If you go to Google Hangouts in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a present now.
Yep, my entire screen. Let me see.
Yep. Perfect. So now I get to see, now I'll like put the chat up and then now I'm looking exactly what you're looking at and then in real time. All right,
Yeah.
so yeah, so if you keep scrolling,
With
Unicode
the,
characters, yeah, warnings are fine. Again, like way too much information.
yeah, it is a lot of information. But
Yep.
I do also like the fact that it's there because the more you learn, the more you can go back to it and be like, okay, this is what a substring is. This is how I work with
Yeah.
it.
Yes, I think the way that MSDN is set up, it's a fantastic reference.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree.
So I
So
think the way
eventually we'll
they,
get to the list.
yeah. So I think the way they actually went through with designing it was, okay. So for a complete beginner, they're going to look at the very beginning and maybe a few snippets, and then when they run into the problem of, okay, I need to do substring or something like that, or
Correct.
how can I do more things with strings? I can go
More
back to
advanced
that.
things with string.
Yeah.
Yep. So keep going. Eventually we'll get to the actual like methods themselves.
Actually, I think they redid that so that it's in different related topics.
So where are the actual methods?
I see string builder.
If you go in the filter by title, could you just type in like system.string and see if that takes us? System.string. Oh, I bet you if you just click string.format, that'll take us to the official documentation on the actual like link to the page where they reference like a method.
Format strings.
Yeah, so right there where it says composite formatting, and you have system.string.
Yep, there it is.
Yeah, so if you click that, that'll probably take you to the official document. Perfect. Okay. So string format, and then if you scroll to the top, there's the namespace where it says system.
Mm-hmm.
And then
And
let's click that, and then there should be a reference to system.string in there.
let's see, I think this is only going to...
It's only about format, right?
So
Oh,
let's
there it
do-
is. Do you see the breadcrumbs at the top? So there's
breadcrumb.
system.
There it is.
Yeah, so you have docs, .NET, .NET API browser, system, and then string.
Yep,
It's the navigation right at the top.
there we go.
And then
Okay, so it's showing all the methods over here.
right. So if you go up one more level, to the string top level. Perfect, string class. All right, so let's see what's in here.
All right, it reiterates string being a sequential collection of characters that are used to represent text. Actually, I kind of like that wording a little bit better. I mean, it's still confusing for someone that's just beginning.
Yes.
But I do like that it's like sequential collection of system.char objects to represent a string. And it takes you up
Yep.
to there. So that one's a little bit better than the other string that we were reading.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I mean, while at the very beginning, instantiating a string object. Oh, so that's how you create a string. And then,
Yes.
oh, here's how we can do it with chars. And when I was first beginning, I was like, what the fuck is all this, you know?
All right, so this is kind of what I was looking for. I'm gonna message you on Discord with this, and so we can like look at this together. And usually when I hear, hey, you need API docs, the expectation is probably something that looks something like what you're about to look at.
There we go. Yeah, that's, even now, I
So-
looked at it and I'm like, information overload.
Yeah. So the biggest criticism I have with this, especially in the context of someone that wants to understand what this thing does, is that it's not sorted topologically. It's not a topological sort, right? It's an alphabetical sort. It's an index. It's like opening up a book, and then instead of reading a table of contents, you decided to open up backwards and read the index instead.
Right.
Right? And that's what all API documentation looks like. And it's not constructive. Because the first thing you see is access violation exception.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I saying this first? Right? You have some of the most complex activator create instance, app domain and app context. These are some of the most complicated concepts in .NET, period.
Right.
So then you see this alphabetical sort of APIs, and then the question comes is like, what do I do with this?
Yeah. It expects you to know what you're looking for. Really, dog? What? Yeah, and that's one of the criticisms I also have with documentation. Things
Yep.
like, okay, here's everything all at once. Figure out what you
In
need.
alphabetical order, with no sympathy for the person that's about to read this.
Yeah. So
And then, right, yeah. So here's the string doc. This is perfect. So let me paste that to you.
I love dual screen. Oh god.
Like, what the hell? Right?
Yeah.
What am I supposed to do with this? So the challenge, though, is there's like it's kind of like a check. It ends up becoming like a checkbox. Like, I will not. Okay, this place has documentation. I'm not going to read it, but let's move on, right?
Right.
So it could be entirely lorem ipsum, and people go, "Yep, Yeah, that's documentation, all right. Okay, and then that's it.
Yeah, when I say documentation for DragonRuby, obviously
Hmm.
there's not a whole lot that's exposed that developers really need to worry too much about. Like, we don't have to
Correct.
worry about the back end STL stuff. Instead, we deal with the actual output stuff and how we
Right.
can work with it. So,
So, so with this context and like how I approach documentation, let's look at this first block again. Okay, here are 6 draw primitives you need to know. And the draw primitives I show you, I show you them in the simplest format, and under the assumption that you don't know Ruby, you know a little bit of programming, and you might know arrays,
right.
right? And as I said before, it would have been better if I explained what X, Y, width, and height were. I made the assumption that I should have been clearer about that. Period.
Yeah, so what I think should actually be done is it's like for solids, I think there should be at least 3 very different examples of utilizing it.
Okay, so that's good. So let's go to the next area. So here's a more complicated example, and let's read the instructions. Okay, so we're going to create a solid background, and in there we're going to create 200 stars made of tiny squares.
Yeah.
We're going to display a label in smoky white. We're going to play some sounds when it starts up. We're going to render a sprite to the screen, draw a border, draw a line and border. And for this one, what I should have done is actually taken a screenshot of what it looks like when you run this code. Because you see the code, but you can't visualize what it actually looks like. I explained it, but a picture would have been much better.
Yeah. So what I mean by 3 different examples with a single thing, it's like strictly only for solids. Like, here's one way you can work with the solids. Here's another way, and then here's a third way, just on solids, nothing else.
So what would be 3 examples of solids?
Good question, actually.
So there's different ways to represent solids, like a hash or a class. But the challenge there is that I didn't want to overwhelm them with the syntactical aspects of Ruby, because I know most people don't use Ruby coming into the language. So inundating them with like, here's a class or here's a type literal for hashes, it becomes very unfamiliar very quickly.
Yeah. So I think you should actually do the hashes and class version as well, just so they can see, okay, you can work with this in these other contexts. Whether or not they know that much about Ruby, it's still one of those, like, for example,
that's fair.
Like, for
just
example,
a little bit
with
of enhancement.
the render target stuff that I was working with. You know how yours was very complex and everything? And then for Boudica's, I actually broke it down. This is what it actually does, and that was just after so much testing I did to figure out what was actually going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
It's like, so having a page that says, this is what a solid is, this is what it does, and here's
I completely agree with that.
3 very different ways that you can approach it.
That's a good idea. So if and I think coming, I defer to you on this. If you would feel that it would have been comfortable to put, let's say, would you be okay with me not showing classes, but at least at the hash approach?
The hash approach would be nice, but
yeah.
The reason
So
I'm
I could
also
totally change it to be arrays and hashes.
Yeah. So the reason I'm partial to also showing the class approach is due to, it's like when you're building your own things, like a camera system, which Boudica's did, and really nice actually. So he actually does classes approach and lib approaches.
Yes.
So his camera defines a class and everything with it. So that way he can call it and utilize it in different ways.
Yes. Yeah. And I agree with you. I think the concept, you might not know what a class looks like in Ruby, but the general concept of a class is ubiquitous across programming languages, right? So how can I use this with the class?
Yeah.
So I think that's fair. I think showing like, oh, you can represent this as a class is a totally sane way of doing it. All right,
Yeah.
sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right, so then if we go to the ninja scene, so I need to put a visual for this, but let's look at the code here. So I did something very careful, was that I introduced the concept of state.
Yeah.
So it's something new that you didn't see before, but it uses the structure that some of the structures that you already have a good understanding of.
Right. I think with introducing the concept of using the what is this called again? Accessories.
Restructuring.
Yeah. So I think you should explain that a little bit, and then show a single example of each one before doing this full scene here. So that way they
I agree.
understand what it does, how it works, and
Right.
what it's actually
should probably
referencing.
explain state by itself. Like this is how you store game data, right? This is a grid. In fact, I don't even need grid. I probably should just remove grid altogether because I could hard code 720 and 1280.
Yeah.
Good. So I like that idea. So I can remove grid, and there should be another sample with state.
Yeah. It's breaking it down so that someone not familiar with the engine or Ruby in general can start getting an understanding without having to go to the Ruby official documentation to learn all this stuff.
Right.
Because the object of DragonRuby is one, it's going to be a simple engine to work with
Yes.
that utilizes Ruby. So you have to
Yes,
take that
absolutely.
concept into mind.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with you. I think I should remove grid, and I should probably create a separate example of state and how state is unique, because there's a unique aspect of state being the arbitrary nesting, right?
Right.
Did you notice that when you started playing with it, like you could just randomly tack on parameters and it wouldn't throw null ref exceptions and it would just work?
The thing is that state actually confuses me because I don't really understand how it all works. And that's just from me not actually sitting down and going, okay, let me just play with state. And that's due to one of my criticisms is no intelligence.
Okay, so just so that we're on the same page with state and why state is like, the state is a differentiator. So this just to continue to agree with you with regards to state and having a separate example of state. State is actually a differentiator for DragonRuby because of its capabilities. So if we go to like CoderPad, I can kind of again, you might already know this, but I think it might be worth showing other people what this looks like. All right, so the cool thing with state is, right, so you've got your def tick args, and then there's this thing on args called state. And the question is, what the hell is this thing? Okay. So state is a data structure. It's a runtime data structure that allows you to arbitrarily define an object graph without actually defining the backing structure. So here's an example, right? So I can do args.state equals 100. Which is like, okay, so what? I could have just declared a variable with value x equal to 100.
Right.
Okay. Well, the interesting thing about state is as I'm evolving the game, I can do, well, actually, you know what? I think all that should be under player.
Okay.
And the thing is that, well, what's the data type for player? I mean, shouldn't that null ref? I haven't defined player. I didn't do args.state.player is equal to something. I'm just going in and, tacking on player, and it's just going to work. I can do like args.state.y.
And why is this useful?
Okay, so how would you do this in C#?
Basically define a player class or a struct and
Right.
have the X and Y.
Perfect. So you have to go through the effort of defining a player class. And then after you define the player class, you define the properties on the player class. There's your struct. And then when it comes to assigning the values of X and Y, you have to first initialize your player class. And then after initializing, set the X and Y value,
Right.
right? So there's that, the challenge, the general frustration I have with game engines today is that they ask you questions about what your game is structured like before you yourself understand it. I don't know if it's going to be a player. It might not be a player. It might be a player. I don't know if it's going to be an enemy. I don't know if it's a collection of players. I don't know if enemy has an HP property or enemy.armor has an HP property. So the with the engines of today, they ask you up front what it is, and it takes away from your ability to just explore the idea that you're trying to explore. It adds friction, and so that's why I created this concept of state.
And you know, after the stream, I'm going to ask you exactly how you built it. I don't want to do that on stream.
Magic.png. Well, and that's one of the reasons why I called it, why I said it's a runtime data structure. It's something unique in the context of DragonRuby. It doesn't exist anywhere else.
Right. So learning how you did that is going to be something I'm going to try and do.
Yeah. So yeah, we can talk about it. It's C code. Just letting you know.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So we can totally talk about that. But it leverages some of the underlying capabilities of Ruby, and the fact that Ruby is a dynamic language, and pairs it with this idea of quickly prototyping. And it's something that's very unique to this framework. The challenge is that it's also subtle. Like trying to explain to someone what state is, and the fact that the air quotes elegance of being able to arbitrarily nest without having to worry about creating the backing structures is not something you appreciate until you realize that you're able to do this and you didn't have to create the backing stores for it.
Right.
Like even if you're familiar with JavaScript,
Yeah.
a little bit, jQuery.
I work with JavaScript at work with Salesforce all the time.
I'm sorry, my condolences. But so like even with JavaScript, so if let's say if I have we can flip to JavaScript now. I can love this thing. All right, so let's say we have JavaScript. So even in the context of JavaScript, I'll have var.state, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do I have to do first? Well, I have to declare it as an empty hash. And if I do state.player.x is equal to 100, this will throw an exception.
Yep.
Right? So now you have to do, wait, state.player is equal to this. Now I can define it. And then I go in and say, well, okay, player is X, Y, and then HP. So then I do HP and I go, well, actually, I want HP to be on armor. Oh, shit. Now I got to declare that. Right?
Yep.
So this is, relatively speaking, less upfront friction than C#, but it's there. And one of the things I love about Ruby, in its semantics, is that it allows you to always continue coding forward.
Right.
So like here's a real subtlety of what I mean by continue to code forward. So let's say I had a 1 times 15, or 5 times 15, okay? But before I do that, and later on I find, well, actually, I need to add like some kind of offset to 15. So the problem is if you type this isn't exactly what you wanted, right?
Right.
Because of order of operation. So you have to code backwards and put a parentheses here, and then code forwards and put a parentheses there.
Right.
Right? So the interesting thing about Ruby is that operators are just method names on a class. So for me to continue coding forwards, I would do this instead. I would say dot plus is that.
Interesting.
It's a very subtle thing, but it allows you to continue to code forwards.
Yeah, that is actually really, really subtle and interesting to do. I didn't even know you could do that.
Yeah, so because like, and this is something that you kind of like have a air quotes aha moment of Ruby is that everything's a method on an object. It's just there's some semantical qualities of Ruby that allow you to ignore the period on operators. But the moment you add it and then you apply these things, then yeah, you suddenly get an order of operation. So being like cognizant and sensitive to this idea of always coding forwards, influence informed this construct of state.
Fair enough.
So let me just we're going back into I guess Ruby land, which is right here. So all that being said, I need to create a separate example for state, so you can do this. Okay. That's the beauty of state.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Oh, and I see you did the weird Ruby-esque syntax of 5 times for forward.
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, when I first saw that, I was like, I have no idea what this is. No idea what it does. And then I'm looking it up and I can't find anything. And then I forget who it was. I think it was Spick in the Discord server explained it. Or Spitfire, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, so he explained it and I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. But yeah, it's like one of those like what's the term I want to use for it? It's one of those intricacies that you don't really learn about until you've used Ruby for a while, or someone shows you, and then you get that aha moment.
Yeah, and coming from other languages, like 5 is a value type. You can't have methods on a value type.
Yeah.
But
Unless
no,
you're
5
using
is a
link.
class. 5 is a class. I can actually, if I want to add something to this, this idea of documentation, maybe for you, 4 is uh, is more reasonable, or more closer to how you want to think about code, right? Like a for loop.
Yeah.
So if you look, we get the error. It says, well, 4 is undefined,
Yeah.
right? So then you're like, well, hold my beer. I'm going to open up integer because it's a class. Then I'm going to define 4. And then I'll do self.times field. Okay, now 4 is defined. Self.times, yield, this is advanced Ruby stuff. There you go. Just kidding. Block. It's totally going to work. Hey, there we go.
Actually, I'm gonna like steal that snippet. Notepad++. There it is. There we go.
Okay, so just another Ruby thing to kind of like drive this idea home is that things in Ruby that you think are like keywords aren't. So for example, let's say if I do, so I've got def hello, I'm gonna, after puts, I'll do raise, OMG error, right? And you see our exception?
Mm-hmm.
Runtime error, OMG error.
Oh, don't you need to
Well,
put it in after that def because of the class?
it doesn't realize the for. It thinks for is a keyword. But let's, just kind of to simplify it a little bit, let's just, and we can remove this. Okay, so say hello always throws an error, right?
Right.
In C sharp, you have you have a keyword for throwing an error,
Yeah.
throw. So here's the thing with Ruby, raise isn't a keyword.
Huh.
It's a method on class. It's a method on object. So if I never want my code to throw an exception, I just redefine raise. And now my code will never throw an exception. There you go.
Interesting.
Isn't that wild?
That's extremely wild. So while coming from more restricted languages, you're like, oh, you can't do that. Oh my God. You're going to throw some major problems your own way. But with Ruby, it's just like, sorry, Beyonce messaging you. Where was I? Oh yeah, so more constrictive languages like C Sharp, where everything's defined and you can't really override system settings for everything. But
Yep.
with Ruby, it's just like, oh, here you go, you can do it.
So then the question is like, why would you ever want to do this here? This is a horrible idea, right?
I could see where you want to create your own custom exceptions.
Well, the thing is like, let's say if I want to log the exception. So instead of bringing like this whole logging framework and having to do that, I can redefine raise to log the exception and rethrow.
And I believe you also do that with DragonRuby with the console.
Do it everywhere.
Because I know Ruby has the text files with the errors explaining what it is.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense on why you would want to do that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's these like subtle aspects of Ruby, and the problem with state and the challenge I had was that if we're looking at the landing page for DragonRuby, I'm assuming this person is a game dev who's never written Ruby before. How do I explain the subtleties of state and explain to them that the things that the engines they're using today and the engines that force them to do those things today aren't something that they don't realize that it's pain until they actually play with state and go, oh wow, I'm not experiencing this pain that I had over there. And you don't realize you're not experiencing it until you go back to Unity or C Sharp and say, wait, I can't do what I was doing in Ruby.
Right. I should probably tell people that we're streaming. That way we get some questions. There we go.
So my general criticism with like the conventional check the checkbox documentation is one, it's alphabetized. Two, you look at it, and the underlying the reason maybe that someone would come in and look at API documentation for a framework is to get a feel for the number of methods it has. You see a bunch of methods, you're like, oh, this thing totally does what I needed to do.
Meanwhile, with DragonRuby, few methods, but very flexible.
Correct.
I totally get that. And
and it's counterintuitive. It's like, oh, there's only 6 primitives. This is horrible, and you're like, no, no, no. This is its power. This is all you need to know.
Yeah. So, let me see. What was one of the other ones? Oh yeah. So, let's see. I noticed that render targets is something that's in DragonRuby, but you don't actually talk about it in the documentation.
Right,
You talk
because it's
about
such a
instances.
complex topic.
Well, the way I explain it is, hold on, let me see. Should probably go to DragonRuby. Render targets. So the way I explain render targets, I should probably just.
And while you do that, I'm gonna pull a link just to kind of show off like the other, and so the thing is like I don't have an answer. I just know that the status quo of documentation is effort I can put in, but it won't yield anything. It won't yield anything valuable, or what we're trying to find value. What we're trying to accomplish can definitely be accomplished in some better way than alphabetized API docs, right?
Yeah, so let me just tack this one down here and make it easier for people to see. So with render targets, the way I explain it is render targets caches an object to be drawn. In the parameters, we state a name, in this case, black, but you can name it whatever you want it to be. So args.renderTarget black sprites, and then you name the sprite, you set the location, and then the sprite we want to be drawn is preset up with the sprites folder called bush.
Right.
Notice we aren't actually setting the sprite in args output sprites call, we are just calling the black name. So args output sprites, and then the parameters, and then black. So it's basically just caching the object to be drawn later. For example, say you have this gigantic background.
Yep.
And you want it to be staggered, or what's the term I'm looking for? You wanted to draw them in specific locations to create like this gigantic background. Hey, Infinity. So if I remove this tick args and just leave this code here, this is actually Boudicca's code with his camera.
Yep.
So let me pull up my documents folder, documents, development, Ruby, DragonRuby, DragonRuby AMD, and run DragonRuby.
Yep.
So we can see this gigantic background that you can just constantly scroll through.
Yep.
Because it's utilizing the render targets. So it's just caching this background with various locations so that it's seamless.
Yep.
I
So
told
here's
Boudicca
how
I
I
was going to showcase it.
So the original when we first were building out DragonRuby, the concept of render targets didn't exist, and what ended up forcing me to create render targets was because of the constrained primitives. You only have these. You only have those few sets of primitives. So then I was thinking about it, and so one was one, I have a constrained set of primitives, and two, think about that idea of like always coding forwards.
Right.
And what I was presented with was I needed a sprite that was just a composition of like a solid with a specific alpha around it, and then just another solid around that kind of as a border. So it was a composition of a border with a light gray background. And then in my head, I was like, okay, well, for me to actually use this in hundreds of places, I have to stop what I'm doing. I have to go over to this Photoshop thing and actually create the sprite so I can use it.
Right.
And then I asked myself, I was like, wait, why can't a sprite be a composition of primitives?
fair question. And hey, Mario or Bouticus.
And so the funny thing is that the side effect is that it's a really great caching mechanism. But it was initially never designed to do that. It was just a means to keep coding forward and say, I want to use this composition of, borders, a black border with the alpha transparency in it to create a modal, but I don't want to have to go and create a PNG. I just want to use that. And so the concept of a render target was created because of that.
Oh, give me a second here. I need to share with you the specific chat embed so that way you can see from every source. Restream IO. There we go. Copied and drag that over here so no one else can see it.
All right, pasted, perfect.
All right, let me know if it pulled up everything properly for you.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, cool.
Well, I have it. I have your Twitch stream open, so I'm just like looking at that. I popped that out so I can see the chat window there.
Okay. So with render targets, the name.
And that's why I don't explain it up front. Is that people? I'm hoping that people accidentally have the same realization I did. Was that, man? I wish there was a way to create a sprite that was a composition of different components.
Now, the only problem with that is if we actually look up what a render target is, the explanation is a lot different. So, render target is a feature of modern graphics, blah, 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 rendered into an intermediate memory buffer instead of the frame buffer. So, what a lot of people do is they'll use that render target to embed, say, a texture inside of another object. So, like a billboard. So a video is playing in the billboard. They would use the render target to do that.
Yeah, so, they'll use it for a camera. There's wonderful uses for it. It's a fantastic construct.
So with the way it works in DragonRuby, I don't think the naming of render target makes 100% sense. But that's just me.
No, I agree. It doesn't. What I would have preferred is that sprites, you could replace path with another nested array. Right. So instead of sprites being a PNG, you could delete where it says PNG and then have a collection of primitives in there.
Right.
It ended up being like render targets was a near enough jump to where you're right. I got to think of a progression to that point, and I don't know the answer to that.
It's one of those things where it's like, rename it to what exactly? What exactly does it do? What name would make sense for it?
Yeah, maybe like dynamic sprite, maybe? I don't know. Programmatic sprite? Programmatically underscore created underscore sprite?
Maybe something like sprite
target?
Underscore or sprite cache sprite, something like that.
Yeah. Yep,
now,
I agree. That part's not fun.
Yeah, it never is, and I have trouble with naming things all the time. As for getting into entity,
yes.
Again, this is way too complex for just understanding how to work with entities. Like
I agree.
And yeah, so we've already talked about breaking it down into simpler ways and then showing.
And so the motivation of an entity is, again, the need to defer defining structure. So let's say, I do the args.state and I have the nesting, and then I find that, hey, this structure is kind of a player. I don't want to call it a player yet, or I don't want to commit to creating a full-blown class. So then this is the next evolution. So you start with an array, and you say, well, this array is kind of like unnamed and it doesn't have real properties. So I'm going to go to a hash. And then you go to the hash and you're like, well, this hash is nice, but I'm putting open bracket, symbol, close bracket everywhere. Well, now the next evolution is an entity. So even again, I'm deferring the need to create a full-blown class.
Right.
And so that's the premise of an entity.
yeah, and also what the entity actually does is creates a bunch of them without eating up so many resources.
Yes, it's a faster construct.
Yeah. So
And the same thing is like you don't worry about it because you naturally, I feel that you naturally evolve to this construct because you need something that's uh, more put together, more cohesive.
well, the way I see it is that you would naturally evolve to it if you know it exists. So that's one of the
Yes.
big challenges right now because of the documentation.
Yeah, and there's a deeper challenge in that usually the languages people use for game dev, there's no intermediary state. It's always class.
Yeah.
You can't. There's no spectrum. So the challenge comes like, how do for someone that's never used Ruby, for someone that's never used a dynamic language, uh, and doesn't understand like the craziness, the crazy power and uh, yeah, the crazy power that you have in the dynamic language. How do I explain to someone that their their uh, their entire like image of the world is incomplete? That this idea of a class is something that DragonRuby considers as a very, very complicated thing, and that there are valid constructs in between class that you can create that are much better for, especially early prototyping.
Right.
And you reject it. If someone told you classes are dumb, for the most part, you go, wait, that's who I am, right?
Luckily for me, because of my experiences with so many different languages,
Yeah, it
yes,
came
I have
naturally. You're like, that's fine.
it's more like I have a preference for classes and everything, but I'm not objected to trying something new.
Yeah, and I use classes like all of my like completed games. There are parts of it that stay kind of like in this intermediary state, but a bunch of it does evolve to classes. It's more of a question of when as opposed to what, right?
Yeah.
I like the idea of deferring that need and continuing to move forward with what I want to do before jumping into a class.
Yeah. So let's talk about sprite limits.
Okay, so one more thing with regards to documentation, just to put this thread in there, and this also makes me question what is documentation or what is API documentation. I'm gonna send you a link, and this is a link to the show and tell, and it's a specific video in show and tell.
All right.
And I'm sure you've seen it, but I mean, it's like one of those things where I have no idea. I still have no idea how Vitter made this.
Yeah. So
Can you show it on the? I don't see it on the. Okay, there it is.
Yeah, I'm downloading it right now, and there we go.
So these are textures with shadows, three-dimensional, that are being dynamically constructed at about 45, 46 frames per second. That was before I did some performance enhancements. So I look at this and go, how the hell did he do that?
Yeah, I have to say, Vitter is definitely a lot better at Ruby than I am, for sure.
Well, so that's the challenge again. It's like he did this with the documentation that exists right now.
Right.
How did he do that?
There's probably a lot of back-end code that he wrote that we don't see, because he didn't share the source of that.
Right,
Although
right. But
I am going to bully him to share that source.
Well, it is open source. He's got it on a GitHub repo. But I guess the premise is that, I mean, he had to use GDK to do this. The interesting part is that the only code he had access to effectively was what was in the samples folder.
Right.
So how was he able to create that with what was in the samples folder? And at the same time, why is the samples folder not sufficient for someone to get started?
currently, the whole idea. Actually, I'm pulling up his source now because I want to see what he did. Raise. There we go. Let me make that a little bigger. Apply factor. Renders triangles. So he defined render half. Slopes. Render map. Yeah, so he basically built.
And he did it with 200 lines.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Like, what the hell? Who is this monster?
Yeah, but it looks like he's just applying a lot of the 3D math behind the scenes, and
Mhm.
basically, the way I see it is he basically recreated what you could do with what is it?
A software-based ray tester or ray tracer kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
But even still, I'm just rendering the 3D is
Right.
crazy.
So it's one of those things where for really because I was thinking like, well, okay, the API documentation that that the stuff that you see on MSDN is for someone that's very experienced in coding, and it's necessary for someone that's very experienced in coding, like someone that knows Ruby very well or like C# very well. For me, the reference document like you see in MSDN should be air quotes perfect because I'm okay with consuming that level of information.
Right. So
But
if we
it almost being a contradiction because you are an experienced developer, you end up not needing the documentation, not needing the API reference,
right. So
which is weird.
So if we go back to his code and everything, we see he redefined or defined his own stuff, which, again, doesn't really need to be in the DragonRuby documentation, but he's still utilizing a lot of the internal stuff, like out solids,
Right.
the accessors, everything. So
And the interesting thing is like look at his structure. He didn't go to classes, right?
Right.
Here's one part where he decides to create, a hash, right? But everything else was like arrays.
Yeah. So it's mostly getting people familiar with the core API of DragonRuby, and then being like, okay, if you want to do more with Ruby, learn Ruby itself. I mean,
Correct.
It's the same thing with C# with Unity or C# with CryEngine. It's basically that documentation is there for you to get used to their specific code, but nothing to do with the core C# code. It's like, okay, now that you have this, apply it based on your knowledge of C#, and you can do anything you want.
So I would say I disagree with that.
Okay, why?
So I disagree in the sense that Unity goes against the grain of what I understand about C#.
That is true. Not gonna lie there.
A perfect example is newing up a game object.
Yeah, the Git component, yeah, that's kind of annoying.
Why can't I like? I've written C# for what now for 18 years, and everywhere I've written C#, it's person equals new person.
Yeah.
But in Unity, I can't do that.
Yeah, that was a struggle for me for a bit as well.
Yep.
And that's because of their philosophy of design, which was instead of using object-oriented design, you're supposed to use behavior-driven design.
I don't care what it's called. I want to be able to new up my object.
I mean,
I want to be able to leverage what I know about C#.
yeah, that was a struggle for me for a while as well until I figured out, oh, I'm not actually supposed to use object-oriented programming with the objects in Unity. What you're supposed to do is their behavior-driven design with all their crap.
Crap is a very good word. Because you get used to it, but it still doesn't make any sense.
Uh-oh. String stop. I am still alive.
Yeah, you're still alive.
Let me check YouTube. Let me see if it's down for me too. YouTube's good. What about Twitch?
Yeah, Twitch looks good. I see everything.
Huh. Oh, I have Twitch up on my Mac. Nope, it's good for me there. D Live is up.
So
I'm not sure.
So yeah, I think the introductory documentation on like the landing page can be better explained. I agree with that. I think it's I think I need to explain like the ordinal positions. I need to introduce the concept of state briefly. I need to introduce the concept of entity briefly, or just remove it. Frankly, I probably shouldn't even use entity.
Well, I think everything that's available for use in DragonRuby should have documentation for it. Like with the 3 examples that we discussed earlier.
Right.
It's and it's mostly just so it's like, okay, these are all the things that are available that you can play with.
Let me think. What value do you get by knowing you can play with it but not understanding what they are?
Well, that's what the documentation is supposed to do. It explains what it is, what it does, and then the examples gives them the ideas of how they can play with it. So they can go, okay, so I can utilize entities. How can I play around with that with render targets? Or how can I play around with that with, say, I don't know, sprites, things of that nature. Or how can I play around with entities with input? That would be a really fun one, actually.
All right, so this is a good question. The samples are a bit convoluted for efficiency in Ruby versus more explanatory for noobs to Ruby and GDK, in my honest opinion. Yeah, and the initial samples were even worse than what you see now. Restreambot, Mario, specifically in the sense that, and I've tried to like even break up the like the labels in the API demos. One thing is I want to order the samples by complexity. So like the first sample is, I would say dirt simple.
Let's pull it up.
Yeah, and that's a great question. Like, really, is it? So that's the intermediate Ruby primer if you actually want to run it. And I do, hey, listen.
Actually, I would say the beginner Ruby primer and intermediate primer isn't exactly dirt simple because it's more interactive learning. So,
yeah, and I put a note saying like, don't read this, just run the code.
Yeah.
So let's go to o1_API_labels.
Yeah, there we go. So this is actually really great explanation of everything. It's like an array, values in this array, generate labels on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And then go down.
And so
labels.
if you notice the API listing also, is I only show the API listing that is actually used in this sample.
Yeah. So I like this, and then showcasing the grid portion is a little more complex. So I would actually say like
yeah, I agree with you. I can remove the grid.
The size, alignment, RGB, font.
Yeah, defer the grid. I agree with you. And then I show how to use hashes also right here.
Yeah, I've actually not touched the hash in Ruby yet. It's not because it's complex or anything. It's just I haven't had a need for it. That's how I base a lot of what I do on. Like, do I have a need for doing X?
Exactly, and it's a beautiful way to approach it.
Well, the other reason I do that is because I run the philosophy of keep it simple, stupid. It's like, regardless of what I'm doing.
I agree with that too. That's why there's only 6 render primitives.
Order of complexity is a great idea. Progression based on samples are nice. Yeah, I agree. And so I haven't had to use hashes. I haven't really touched state because of that. It's like
Mhm.
everything I've done, it's mainly okay. So how can I take this information I have and use
Yep.
it in the way I want? So with the button tutorial, I was like, okay, I need an input. I need something that showcases something being clicked. I need
Mhm.
to showcase the sprites. So
Yep.
these are the main items I need. So now I can kind of just build it based off that.
Yeah. So just to kind of give you like an idea of like where I'm taking the documentation or my airport's vision of the documentation. Um, if you go to fiddle.dragonruby.org,
Yep.
so what I'm working on is like a web page that has very, very focused samples. And what's going to happen is the chat is covering the render. I don't know if you care about that or not.
I should totally fix that. I guess I'll shift that over to the right or the left. All right, that should
Yeah, you could
update.
probably just make everything smaller and it'll work. Can you do a rundown on the use case for primitives and DR? Like primitives as in the actual like primitives property, or like primitives as in all the primitives that are available, Spitfire.
Hash primitives. Probably not the one that he's talking about. I think
Well,
he's
let's
just
look at it.
talking.
Let's look at what primitives hash primitives is.
All right, so it's talking about out output sprites, labels, solids, borders, lines. So this is creating a hash for positions, the
So
sprite
it's
size.
showing you how you can represent each one of these primitives as a hash. Okay, the property primitives. Gotcha. Okay, so that's a good question. Um, there was a deliberate ordering to the primitives inside of DragonRuby, and the motivation is that outputs.solids is always renders at the bottom.
Let's see, primitives. So there we go. Is that the one he's talking about, or is he talking about the hash one?
Yeah. So so if you notice in that first example, I have outputs.solids.
Yep.
And then outputs labels, sprites, lines, borders, and sounds. So the question was, well, then what's primitives for? If I have these properties, what's a primitive? Why have the primitives property?
Good question.
That's a great question. So an example would be, let's say that like you have a button, right? A button is composed of a border and a label, right?
Right.
So let's say you created like a nice little helper method that you pass in an X, Y, and a string, and it returns those two primitives to you.
Mm-hmm.
So then, am I being forced to like destructure that and put the right one in the right bucket? That's no fun.
In the right bucket.
Yeah. So like, if we go back to fiddle
Yep.
and actually go to CoderPad, and then you can type what I type into fiddle.
Okay.
But def take args, and let's assume I create something called button, right? And it takes an X, Y, and text, right? And so a button is two things. It's a border with a label in it. So here's my border, right? I'm gonna do X, Y. We'll say the width is 100, the height is 50. And then the label is, just X, Y. We'll say it's like left aligned and it's text,
Okay.
right? So now the problem is if I do args dot outputs dot labels, or I'm going to call the button, right, a new button, is equal to, we'll set the x position to 100, the y position to 1,000, and we'll call it hello world.
All right.
So how do I render this? Are you telling me that I have to do new underscore button or labels is equal to new underscore button 0? And then the other, or sorry, borders is first. See, I already messed it up where this should be borders. And then, well, that's dumb.
Right. That would be counterintuitive.
Yeah, that's not fun. I mean, I went in through all this effort to compose it into this like nice little function, and then I'm still exposing the structure because of that. Then, so that's why primitive was created. It lets you put anything in there. Then you can just do that.
All right. So let's put that in the fiddle.
Yep. END. Yep. Save. And you get an exception, which I expected. Args.outputs.primitives. You may need to call one. All right. So here's my vision of documentation. So read the exception.
Exception is.
Do you see where it says error colon?
I should probably be wearing my.
At the very top.
There we
You can go in a full
Can
screen.
I add 1,000 or 100?
There's a button for full screen. You see that in the bottom right corner?
There we go.
Or yeah. Okay, so the error message starts at the very top. Error.
Can I add 100,000, 150 to outputs primitives? Auto guessing in primitives has been depreciated. Need to mark the value explicitly as a primitive. To do so, do one of the following.
So let's look for the value 100, 1,000, 150. Like, I was like, what is it talking about? All right. And so that's line 3.
Line 10, actually.
Well, line 10 is where the exception is, but line 3 is the primitive that was derived. Because we passed in 100, 1,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second two parameters, 150, were the additional part. So it's saying you need to tell me what this is, and you do that by adding .solid, .label, .sprite, .line, or .border at the end of the array.
So going back to the playground, yeah. So this should be .label, I think. No, solid.
If you want it to be a solid square, yeah.
And then this one is label.
Yep. Uh, 1,000 is probably too far. It's probably off the screen. 720 is the width, so probably on 200 or 300.
Yeah, let's do 450 to be centered.
There we go. There you go.
Yeah.
That's a good looking button. So the premise here is that what I was going for is that intuitively someone might compose a button to be a collection of other primitives, and then they'll get an exception that kind of guides them to where they should go.
Right. If they can understand how the exception is phrased.
Yes. Yeah. So adding good markers is one thing, but if you think about, let's say I put this in, large amount of documentation. One, I don't know if they're going to read it. So then you get an exception that you don't even understand,
Right.
which happens all the time in our code.
Yep. So let's just let's just remove that and then run it again to see the exception again. So yeah. So cannot add 100, 450, 1050 to output to primitive.
Yep.
So it's just like, okay, so why can't it add? And that's where understanding how the primitives work comes into play. So the documentation talking about that would be extremely helpful.
So the question, I agree there needs to be documentation. I'm not disagreeing with that. What I'm thinking about is how did they get to this point?
Right.
So they've been coding with GDK long enough such that there was an intuition about it that they can compose these primitives and create helper methods around it.
Or maybe they just copied code that they saw online, which happens a lot as well.
For DragonRuby, there's no code online. There's not enough code out there. Possibly, but like think about your own programming intuition. You're like, well, I've used this in 2 places. Why don't I just put it in 1 place?
Right. Now, for me, because I actually didn't know you could do this, I wouldn't have thought to do that.
And a part of me is like, that's totally fine.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking is that we, the community, can actually help out with documentation like that, showcasing different examples. Like with my button tutorial, I can do an updated one using the properties version.
Yeah.
So it still keeps in the same spirit of it. It's just, okay, here's another way to do it, and it adds more to the documentation that already exists based off my tutorial with the explanations.
Yeah, and I love the concept. So there's API documentation, and then there's tutorials, and I love tutorials. I prefer tutorials many times over to documentation or API, like very structured. Whatchamacallit? I call it what's like sterile, stoic, unemotional documentation.
Right. Let me just go ahead and add this to my notepad.
Yep.
Wrong one, damn it.
And so like there's a part of it where a part of me says don't add it, because eventually over time, either using Ruby or some version that you will find, and you'll gain this, you'll try, I wonder if I try this, and then you will discover it, is kind of the goal for me.
Yeah, but there's only so much that you can do with discovery. And that's where I know we really and that's where we diverge a little bit, because I know you're big on discovery. Like, oh, you can do this based off of this, based off of this other thing. But then it's
so
like,
the question is, are you ready to discover it?
Right.
If you couldn't intuitively get to it, am I doing you a disservice by showing it to you?
That's a philosophical question, more so.
Yeah, it is.
DragonRuby, IamFast.io has both tutorials and API documentation. I've intentionally placed it in GitHub just so we can have community-driven documentation site. So let's go ahead and go to that. DragonRuby.IamFast.io.
Yep.
I feel that one personally, and Mary knows it easy. Yeah, so, like if we look at how I did the buttons, like I did the accessors and then created, let me just scroll down to the final code. So, yeah, so just creating this could actually be done using the properties, but not knowing about the properties working that way, well, you're not exactly going to go, okay, let me go ahead and do that. You don't know it exists. So
I like that. So the interesting idea is, or if I was using GDK and it didn't give me that, what I would ask Amir, that dumbass, is why didn't GDK recommend doing it this way.
Right. But not everyone's going to be able to go, okay, I should ask Amir.
No, I'm saying GDK should do it. So like, think about it this way. So you have output stop borders, and GDK knows the order that you're adding this stuff. So could GDK have went, okay, this person added a border, and then immediately after adding the border, added a label, and the label is inside of the border. They're trying to create a button.
Well, I don't really think that GDK should do something like that. It's like, oh, let's automatically change the code to do this.
No,
it
it just lets you know. It gives
or
you like an
automatically
notification
suggests.
code.
It's like the suggestions are nice, but at the same time, if you don't understand how it works, you're just going to see this suggested change and then change to it, and then you're going to be like, I have no idea how this code should work.
So let's take this example, right? The moment you run this code, GDK goes, okay, I know a button is a common thing that developers build. And I know the properties of a button is that there's some container and there's a label that isn't the bounds of that container. And if I see immediately the addition of a container and then right afterwards a label within the bounds of that container, it's a possibility that what they're trying to represent is a button. And if they are, then I recommend using primitives instead. Especially if right after that's done, I see a request for inside rect and mouse click.
Well, if you do all that, you might as well just create a button class itself inside of DragonRuby.
I avoid that to keep the API simple.
I know, but at the same time, it's like, if it's going to make all these suggestions in the console so that people can read, you might as well just already have the class. That's just my opinion on it.
Yeah. So no, and I appreciate that. So, and that's a challenge that I've had. Is do you know? Have you watched that like Rich Hickey video, Simple Made Easy?
I think I might have.
So the gist of it is that he does it's a very good like what's it called? He talks in a very like assertive way with regards to the use of those words. And what he said was that essentially simple is something that can be objectively measured. The word simple, or saying something is simple, is an objective measurement. And easy is a synonym for familiar. So when someone says, oh, this is easy, in my head, I hear this is something that is familiar to me. Right. And then when someone says simple, it means that the dependencies to construct that specific component are not intertwined. They're not complicated. So the alternative is the opposite of simple is complex, and the opposite of easy is hard. And the way he put it together in like one kind of sentence is that something that is hard or unfamiliar can become easy just over time with practice, right? Something that you thought was hard can become easy. Something that is complex, it's very hard to make something that's complex simple.
That is true.
So when I look at the API documentation, it isn't easy. The easy thing would be to have a button class. The easy thing would be to have a Bezier class for Beziers. The easy thing would be to have a text box class. Those are familiar. There's an expectation for those to be there. But with each additional class, I'm adding complexity.
Yes.
And then the premise is that, well, it's good to have these, like easy classes, because then you have all these things that you can do, and it's great. The problem is that there's a what you gain there, you take away from the upfront ability to just use it. An example is like, have you ever done any like React programming or like React Native?
Thankfully, no.
Thankfully, no. An example would be, we'll take WinForms, WPF.
Yes.
Okay, so you have stack panel, you have flow layout, you have table, you have text area, you have all these different controls that exist out there.
Mm-hmm.
You have buttons that can house videos. You have grid layout. You've got percentage-based, resizing of grid layouts with columns and row columns. You have value properties. You've got property converters. You've got all this stuff. And you look at this going, what the hell is all this crap? There's so much under the hood. And for me, it's like, do I take that, or do I say a view that you see on the screen can be deconstructed into what's it called? Imaginative ways of using primitives. You look at any GTK UI, you can deconstruct it into those primitives.
Correct.
And the fact that there's only 6 of them, that's it.
Yeah, and
That's all you get.
Spitfire said, I agree with Amir here. Keeping the API rudimentary allows allows the user more flexibility in their end cases. I like to do weird stuff with buttons. Something like that primitives allows a ton of flexibility without complexity issues. And then Mario says, but then the convenience function that a lot of game devs have come to expect are lacking, and no bail DragonRuby.
And I understand that. Like, it's that give and take, and this is the general challenge that I have, is that I feel that people are used to the easy. They know Unity, they know their existing game engine. So what they know is easy, and they forget the 6 hours that they spent watching training videos to get a prefab on the screen.
And Mario also said, I guess the answer is a set of libraries, maybe DragonRuby approved libraries with these functions built to handle these. Actually, I like that idea. It's like,
yeah, and I agree with this too. This is something that I defer to the community. So it's like, look, you want a cool control suite? Reach out to this guy.
yeah, I think we as a community could actually build something like that.
Yeah.
Like a really cool library that does a lot of things.
And
that
frankly,
simplifies it.
and the other premise is that you should be sustainably supported, right? So it's like, you want this control library, if you can afford it, you're going to pay for it, and you're paying someone that is a good person, and that will help you out. Like, why wouldn't you want to support it?
Right. And
Right.
duck typing with duck primitive marker is your button class. Thanks,
Yep.
Spitfire.
The interesting thing with games also is that you're going to create this button class, and some person's going to be like, this is not the button that I want.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do something, I want to give it like a cool, like, cyberpunk feel. And it's like, well, great. Now, you don't have the button class anymore.
Yeah. And
So
with something
it's
like
tricky.
that, it's more stylistic.
Yeah, and so what I decided was that I would rather prefer people are able to derive and reinvent any one of the constructs like a button trivially.
Yeah.
And it's trivial. Like, it was trivial for you to do this.
It was. It had a little bit of challenges with it, just because I was like, okay, how do I do the mouse click? And then I had to go to the sample for that, and then
Mm-hmm. And you knew there was like that sample that had a button in it, so you're like, okay, let's see how the hell he did that.
No, the sample was just clicking in the screen, and then
Okay, yeah.
I believe I deferred to someone about, okay, I only wanted to be inside of something, or
Yeah, so,
the sample did that.
Yeah, so like there's ones like the API demo, the 99 API. If you go back to the DragonRuby website,
Yep. Where is that? Right here.
number 3, and if you scroll down, there's like an animated GIF. When DragonRuby first released, there was only one. Oh, it's at the top. Sorry. There it is. It was right after the YouTube video.
Oh, right here, yeah.
That was the only sample we had.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there it is. There's the click me.
Yeah, for the intersecting. So, oh yeah,
Well,
there's
right there's the
click
click me and watch me fade.
Yeah,
There you go. There's your button. So
Yeah,
that's one of the reasons why I say go to the samples. Play, like, run the samples. Study the samples, because there are I've always wanted to make a roguelike. Of course there's a roguelike sample. When I did the craft jam and the crafting thing, I made a crafting sample out.
yeah,
You want to do vertical platform, 2D platforming, I made a 2D platforming sample out. And it kind of gives you like that springboard to create your own thing.
yeah. So let's take a look at my button versus the one in this sample.
Yep.
Let me mute the audio. Okay, audio is muted. Don't care about looking at me. I thought I added an image in there. Huh. Okay, I'll do that with the next version, where it's more looking like a real button. See, the problem with both of these is that it doesn't look like a real button. It just looks like a border with text in there that you can only click inside of.
Yep. Yeah, and then the question comes like, well, how do I create a button with rounded borders? Simple. Create a sprite.
Right.
That's your only option. Create a pretty sprite. Have fun.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I'm always thinking of when I'm looking at stuff. It's like, okay, how can I make this more similar to what people are used to, coming from various game engines and working with various.
Right, so
frameworks.
open up Unity. Let's take a look at Unity's button.
All right. Unity Hub. I hate how slow Unity is now. It's like first you gotta open the hub, then you open the project.
You get no argument from me there. I completely agree with you. I'm in 100% agreement, sir. Man, you
Then
can
the
build
package manager.
you could build a game with DragonRuby by now. Jeez.
CryEngine's faster, but I don't know how to do buttons in C++ yet. And they also heavily utilize Scaleform, which is a lot more involved. That's why I don't do too long just to get the thing open. Dude, older versions of Unity was so much faster.
Almost there.
It's there. Update check. I don't care. Let's just do a new scene.
All right,
Okay,
new scene.
so
So this is easy.
UI.
This is
and
totally easy, right? Look at the familiarity with it. You're like, oh, I want a UI and add a button. Okay, can we do, so think about everything that you just did.
Mm-hmm.
Reorienting the camera to try to get it in view, to put the button in place.
I can also do this. Screen space camera.
Wait, what was that? What'd you click there?
Right? Why isn't my button not showing? Oh,
We're still trying to can we just get to the button?
there we go.
So like, you're familiar with Unity. Unity's easy at this point, right?
Yeah.
So think about someone coming in, right-clicking and adding button, and then having to even reorient the screen to see the button. Think about all the complexity that was involved with doing that.
Yeah, it took me a bit to figure it out. I'll be honest.
And then it becomes second nature, right? Because you've done it so long.
Mm-hmm.
So and then people forget the complexity. They remember easy. Oh, I just right-click, go to UI, and select button.
Yeah.
right? And so now you have this button thing. All right, so we've got interactable. You've got color. You have transition color tint. All right, so that's cool. Like if you go from like normal color to highlighted color to pressed color.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so and there's a disable color. What is this color multiplier?
Let me change the.
Yep. So let's experiment. Let's change. Let's do it.
So color multiplier just basically shifts the value, I think.
How to go from orange to yellow though? What does that mean?
Why isn't it pulling up the information? I think it's with the color, it adds a multiplier which lightens the color. Okay, let's do another. So let's change to.
We should see like a light blue of some type.
Let's do a dark blue. Color multiplier. Yeah, it's a lightning multiplier.
Okay, cool. So it adds white to the saturation
Mm-hmm.
of the color. Cool. So, so this is great. This is easy. There's some complexity. The underlying construct is complex because it's got all these things in there.
Right.
All right. How do I put this button on a 720p device at 100 and 400, like we did in DragonRuby?
So with Unity, you have to. Let me see, where is it? Oh, edit. Preferences, right?
Okay.
No, that's not it. Graphics team. Oh, I'm a dumbass. So display. So you set the display to be what you want it to be. So 1024 by 768. And then
We want 16 by 9, right?
16 by 9. There we go. And then the button. Because of their XY coordinate system, relative based off of everything. Since this is in camera space, then it's going to be 3.2 by 0.2, something like that. So, 3. That's more standard.
So X is 3.
Yeah, since it's relative to the canvas itself, which is set at 0190, 704, 396, being in the camera render space. Since it's a child, then you're only moving the child object.
Okay.
Yeah, explaining that is a pain in the ass.
Cool. So the good thing again is that the ability to discover the button is behind a menu.
Yeah.
It's very UI and IDEs are very easy. They're accessible from that standpoint, and that's a good value prop. The problem is that you hit the wall. So I want to add, when the button is clicked, a nice ripple from the center, from the point that it was clicked, like a little circle sprite that kind of spreads out and fades away over 2 seconds.
Welcome to having to create a script to do that.
Well, so that's one thing. The other thing is that maybe now, so have you painted yourself into a corner by using a button component?
No, because you can see how here on the bottom, on click, you can add
Okay.
scripts to it.
All right, so then the script references a sprite component?
Yes, you can reference a sprite component in the script.
Okay.
God, I really don't want to write that code. New behavior script because I don't feel like naming it properly. Hey, Inspector, what are you doing? Inspector? Hello?
This demonstrates my point perfectly.
Runtime. Editor in runtime. Gotta create empty object. Screw it, I'm not naming it.
Wait, what's this empty object thing?
It's where I'm going to attach the script to, so that way I can reference the object. In the
So now you have to create a game object that references both the button and the script.
No, it just references this empty object. It just houses the script itself. So now, if I actually had a script in there, or
wait, so you can't associate a script component, a script directly with a button object?
No.
Why not?
Due to how Unity decided they wanted to create objects.
So I mean, like the consistency stuff, right? If you create a sprite, you can add a physics body 2D to it. You can add, scripts to it directly, right?
Yep.
You have a camera, you can add scripts to it scripts. You can add scripts to it directly. Why can't I do it for a button?
Because of Unity.
Yeah, and this is where the complexity comes in, because they've created this construct for you. It's a really easy construct to work with, but because of the intrinsic complexity that was involved in creating this, there's a limitation that it's hard to explain.
Yeah. And me being the way I am, I'm kind of obligated to explain it.
No, and it's not an obligation. It's more of this like demonstration of easy versus simple.
Yeah.
Unity has given you something that's very easy,
Yeah.
which is good. Which is good. It helps you get up and running. It makes you feel productive, until you're not.
Yeah. So let me just close this down because I don't really like
And then-
to use Unity unless I actually am working on the game.
Yeah, and the thing is that you have the knowledge to actually create the ripple effect. You knew to create the game object that has the script handler to it, and then for the button to associate the game object to that, and then you would do the animation to show like the ripple effect with like maybe like a widget or a sprite, along with like the key press and the key down and everything, which is good. But then you demo that to someone and say, "Hey, cool! Look at this cool thing that I made." Everyone's going to say, "How'd you do that?"
Right.
Hey, that's really cool. How'd you do that? Where's the source? And for me, the goal is when they see something like that done in DragonRuby, they go, okay, I get how you did it. I get how you did it. It's a cool effect, and you put in a lot of work to construct that effect. And I can derive it myself, or I can pay you to just use yours. And it's going to be immediately familiar to me because I know you're using the same primitives I use.
Right.
You're just using it in what's it called? Imaginative ways, right? In
Right.
unique ways.
Now, with CryEngine, you'll see that there is. Oh, let me create a new scene.
How are you liking CryEngine?
I love CryEngine. This is my favorite engine. Yeah, let's open this.
All right.
So, give it a moment here. I prefer to use CryEngine on my actual rig versus this one just because how intensive it is. But you'll notice that with your create objects, you don't have anything for UI.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because you have to use scale form to do so.
Okay.
And then you have to import that into the engine and then reference it. Ow! Yeah, so it's a little more complicated with CryEngine. I know you want to. But at the same time, they don't leave anything there for, okay, it's going to be easy just to create a basic button. Instead, it's...
And now you're stuck, right?
So sitting here, you're like, okay, I want to create a UI. So
Right.
you actually have to go to CryEngine button.
Mm-hmm.
So creating the basic UI, CryEngine. So you actually have to go to the docs, and then they tell you this is the entire thing you have to do in order to create the control.
Right.
So user interface, UI elements,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's like, okay, so you have to do this XML file, which is part of scale form, and then you have to actually do the action script for it. Then, after you've done that, then you import it into the engine, which you have to use a node to do, or visual scripting, if you so
Right.
choose. Or you can do it directly in C++.
Yeah. And when I see this documentation, it is fantastic documentation.
Yes.
You know, it's step by step. The claim I'm making is that the answer to create a button, or the response for me when someone's, how do I create a button, is like, well, how would you create a button with the primitives you have?
Yeah.
And they would go, well, I guess it would be like, do you want a simple button, or do you want something that looks like cyberpunk? I was like, well, I want cyberpunk with these like cool gradients and stuff. I was like, well, you know how to create a sprite? And they go, yeah. And you know how to put text on a sprite? And they go, yeah. Well, there's your button. And they go, like, but really? And I'm like, yeah, it's just, that's it. That's your button. Another question from here. Why is the alpha position in the label array at the end of the RGB, but in the sprite array, it's before the RGB? That's a good question. So what I found was that with sprites, at least when I was building my games out, I found that the sprites would be the closest thing to the thing I wanted to change about a sprite. So the more often the thing would change, the closer it is to the front of the array. So for like a border or solid or a label, RGB, I found that I was changing size and alignment and keeping the default color black more on a label. For a sprite, what I found that I changed the most was the alpha property, like things fading in, fading out. And then after that, the thing that I found that I changed the most after that was the angle, and then the color saturation. When that happened, I saw that this thing makes no sense, right? I was asking myself the same question, like, well, is this alpha? Is this angle? Is it color? What is it? That's when named hashes came into play. So the premise is that you outgrow the named based the ordinal positioning of a label or a sprite or a solid or whatever, and then to avoid any ambiguity on what value you're changing, you transition to a hash. But at least the reasoning behind it is that it would be the properties that you change the most versus the properties that you would change the least are towards the end. So for a sprite, RGB or color saturation wasn't something that I would change often. So that's why it ended up towards the tail end.
And Boudica said, love this show, guys. Gotta go. Looking forward to the recording. Great points brought up. Big ups for that primitives review. Had no idea how easy that button thing was. Incredible.
Yeah.
Thanks, Boudica. And see you in Discord at some point later or tomorrow.
Yeah. So that was kind of the reason behind it. It was the RGB saturation capability didn't exist in DragonRuby until I needed it. And when I needed it, it was because when I wanted to like flash a sprite to have some kind of damage. And I was like, man, I don't want to have to create like a flashed overlay and then fade that out. Is there any way I can change the color saturation? And that's what happened.
Makes sense, but I think at the same time, consistency should be key when creating functions.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of the consistency is that I do try very hard for the location to always be the first parameters, right? The geometry. It's either a point or a rectangle,
Right.
and then what comes at the end is a crapshoot when it comes to sprites.
Yeah.
But for lines, borders, and solids, RGBA is what happens at the end. But yes, at that point, I definitely recommend you going to sprites. I mean, going to hashes as your named parameters.
All right. And let's see, what else can we talk about with the documentation?
So yeah, so back to that idea of like, why is that's my argument, is that the reason there isn't a button class is because I want the contract for creating components and things in GDK to eventually resolve to a large collection of these primitives. So no matter what complexity someone creates with regards to like their class structure, at the end of the day, I can intercept that complexity right before render and change it. And that's one of the reasons why why everything is an array, because nothing is a side effect. So if I use your button class and it did 80% of what I wanted it to do, I am it has to go into outputs.arrays. It has to go in there, right? You have no choice. So then from there, I can intercept it and do something else with it.
All right, and my dog's barking at me to let him out. So
All right.
give me like 5 minutes, and then we'll continue on. So
Sounds good. I'm gonna get some more water.
all right. All right, and we are back. So before
Let me
going
see
into
one more example.
the example, Spitfire said, "Wouldn't using a ton of named hashes be more taxing on performance than a ton of arrays?"
Yeah, and so what I explained was that an array is essentially a hash where the keys are integers.
Okay, good. To
Makes
know.
sense, right? It's like, oh, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. All right, so moving on to the final example.
Yeah, let me show you. So just to drive this idea of like simple versus complex. Um, let me see if I can. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I'll find it. I'll find it. Doo-doo-doo. So this is another thing like uh, Arnund made. Let me find. Let me find the thing. Little Boxes has made some really cool stuff too. All right, here we go. So let me share this video with you. The same idea here. Think about so the YouTube video that you see. Imagine like explaining it in the context of Unity.
All right.
Okay, so let's say you see this, right?
Yeah. So parallax scrolling, it looks like, and then really instead of controlling the player, you're controlling the parallax scrolling, and for the speed itself, all you're doing is kind of adding like a slight little image overlay and then making the scrolling faster. That's how I see it being done.
Right. So with regards to Unity components and prefabs, uh, how many different constructs would you create?
Let's see, foreground, background, sprite, and then also you need a camera and the extra sprite for that little flash with the speed. Or you could do a particle effect, however you want to do that portion.
And then what are these underlying components and properties that you'd be changing?
Uh,
So you'd be doing get component, and then what would be the construct that comes back when you do get component?
it just gives you access to the class.
Well, you got the transform component, right?
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about the actual methods available. So yeah, you have transform. In this regard, yeah, you'd be using transform.
Right. So transform has XY vector or XY scale.
Mm-hmm. X, Y scale, rotation.
Right. So what about the transparency stuff?
Transparency is built in, so if you have, say, a sprite that has a transparent background, Unity automatically reads it and will do the transparency for you. But I do
Right.
believe
So
you also
if
have
you want to
access.
set that programmatically, because like some of the transparency you can see like flash and then go away.
Uh,
There's like a render component, I think.
yes, there is a render component, 2D render and 3D.
All right. So this would probably have a 2D render component to change the alpha.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have key events, right?
Mm-hmm.
For setting the vector, you have a vector type.
Yep.
You have to construct a new instance of that vector type and then do identity dot
Quaternion dot identity. Yeah.
for 0. So now you've got that class that you need to incorporate.
Mm-hmm.
So to build this scene, you have to be aware of these a collection of very easy classes that are available: transform, sprite renderer, vector. I can never pronounce that.
Quaternion.
Quaternion. You've got Quaternion. You've got a function called getComponent. Then you've got how would you do the parallax?
Oh, actually, now that I'm looking at it, it's not exactly parallax. Because parallax means one thing's moving in one direction and the other's moving in the opposite. And from this, if you actually were to playback speed, let's take it to 0.25, you can see they're moving in the same direction.
Right. So what would be the thing that allows you to do that?
So basically, what you'd be doing at that point is just you set it with the camera, with the image, the background image, and the foreground image. As well.
All right, so you have camera with two properties, background and foreground. Okay.
Well, no, those are separate components. So in this scenario, what you'd actually be doing is you'd be setting the player object to be a child of the camera. And then with the foreground and background, you set it to loop, but then you're also on input, say you're moving left in this scenario, you'd be controlling the scrolling speed of the background and foreground.
And those are properties on background and foreground, scroll speed?
No. In that scenario, it'd be transform, translate.
Okay, so you would use the transform component. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then you said you mentioned looping, so there's a property to make it loop, or?
I believe they added that with the latest version, but typically what I do is just build out like how it would do parallax scrolling, but have it go in the same direction instead of opposite.
So how do you get the background to repeat?
There is a repeat component to the image class.
All right, so then you would add a repeat component to the image class.
Yeah.
All right. So.
Or a clamp repeat. I believe there's also ping pong. Or no, wait. That's
so 9, 10-ish different constructs and classes.
Something like that.
And each with their unique APIs, right?
I actually have to sit down and recreate this in order to tell you exactly how much be done.
Right. So the good thing is that there's a sense of comfort that Unity has these concepts built in.
Yeah.
Right. I can refer to them by name. Parallax. I can do Unity search for Unity parallax, and I might find something that gives me what I need.
Right.
Or Unity repeat image, scrolling image, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once you find it, once you find the properties in the inspector and then associate the right game objects, it's all easy.
Yeah.
How would you do this in DragonRuby?
Me personally, lots and lots of trial and error.
Well, so...
I mean, I would obviously create sprites for the background and foreground.
Right.
And then
every tick, you would, when it's past 720, you would bring it back to the front.
Right.
And you might have two of them, right, two of them side by side, right, and kind of like bring them in.
Right.
And then the foreground would work the same way.
Yeah.
Right. And then there would be a sprite for the actual player, and it would shift up and down.
Yeah.
And then when they press the button, you would create sprites that create the blurring aspect of it, and then a sense of jittering by controlling the X and Y position, and kind of, probably adding some randomization to how it's shifted back and forth.
Right.
But it's all sprites.
Yeah.
And then your render order would be exactly this, right? You would add to the sprites output array in this specific order to make sure that you got it in the background and foreground.
Yeah.
It's one construct, and you can do it all with arrays.
Makes sense. Now, Was this was actually made in DragonRuby, wasn't it?
Yep.
And no game dev. That's probably one of the developers that works with you on DragonRuby.
No. He's a random dude.
Oh,
He built this.
is that the Hollow Knight sprite?
Yep.
Okay.
He went in to create the Hollow Knight Sense of Speed.
Okay. I was like, that sprite looks familiar. I've never played Hollow Knight, but it looks familiar.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's just that's it. And I think that's where the simplicity shows, is that you don't have parallax. There's no, if you search for the word DragonRuby parallax control, you won't see anything. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You've got these 6 constructs. Be creative, and this is what people do.
Yeah. But again, the whole thing with be creative, while it is good, at the same time, a lot of people aren't going to necessarily just be creative right out of the gate. They're going to be like, okay, I want to learn more with the engine before I start playing around with stuff.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the big things for me. It's like, I don't know everything with it, so I'm like, I'm going to push off on that because I'm not quite sure how to handle that with DragonRuby specifically.
Right. And so that's the difficult part for me, is that it's, even though like the intersect rect or inside point, I mean, those can be derived. Like, even if you didn't know they existed, it would be pretty easy for you to say, well, you know, the rectangle is defined by x, y, width, and height, a little bit of 8th grade geometry, and I can figure out if the mouse is inside of it, right?
Yeah.
So the premise is that this is all there is. And people see that as a detriment, as opposed to a benefit.
Yeah. Because a lot of people, as you said earlier, expect more to be there with the API.
Right.
Now, as I'm programming with DragonRuby, there's a lot of things where I'm like, oh crap, what's the name for this? What's the name for that? So on and so forth. Crap, I wish I had IntelliSense to tell me.
Yeah. And for those advanced things, yeah, I think render targets is one of them. That's like one of the advanced concepts that keeps coming up, is like, you don't know you're going to need this, but let's take the effort to explain render targets and its full API to you. I think that one's really important. I think another one would probably be like persisting game data.
Yes.
I think that one's important. Another one would be JSON, like retrieving JSON and saving JSON, retrieving XML, saving XML, and then retrieving HTTP and saving HTTP.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of like functions on like the $GTK that would benefit from having a reference doc that says these are available to you. You may not know that.
Yeah.
And they're tiny. There's like 5 or 6. It's like, here's how you save a file. Here's how you read a file. So you've got file I/O, you've got JSON parsing and XML you've got data transform, and it works on hashes and primitives, and then saving and retrieving game data. And there could definitely be some API endpoints to that. And I think those are small enough to where having that on the main page actually makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, look, this thing has HTTP. Cool. This thing has the ability to read JSON, save JSON, read XML, parse XML.
Yeah.
And it's one line. It's like, here's the XML. Here's how you parse it. Now it's a dictionary. Have fun.
Exactly. Now, I will say, I do have a lot of fun when I'm actually working in DragonRuby.
Mm-hmm.
And that's mainly because it's more of a puzzle for me right now. It's like, Unity is no longer fun because it's not a puzzle. There are aspects of CryEngine that's still a puzzle. It's like, one of the big things on why I jump around to many different game engines is because of the puzzle aspect.
Yeah, and with this, they're using the same like nail and hammer that I'm using. So at the end of the day, he's this is all he's got. So I should be able to do this too, right?
Yeah. And then there's also the aspect of, because I'm not super well versed in Ruby, there's certain things
Right.
that is more of a puzzle there. It's like, okay, so how do I do
Yeah.
this in Ruby? Does it translate over to DragonRuby fine? Things like
Right.
that.
And so one of the fundamental fundamental decisions that I made around that is that everything's an array.
Yeah.
So you commit, like when someone asks me like I need to learn Ruby, where do I start? I say, just memorize everything that's an array. Be super awesome at manipulating arrays. And once you understand how to do that, you'll have all the power you need to work with DragonRuby.
Yeah.
And as you've noticed, arrays are very powerful. Like the filter, select, map, all the different ways you can, coerce an array into what you need.
Now, here's a question. I don't know if it's actually in the engine or not. Is physics and collision detection built into the engine, or do we have to build that by hand?
The collision you've seen, right? The intersect rect and stuff. Well, let me do it this way. You've seen the platformer sample labs, right?
Yes.
After looking at the platformer sample labs, what would you say about collision?
Let me pull it back up. It's been a while since I've actually looked at it.
I would do the it's called
Platformer
platformer collision right there. Yep. I would go ahead and run that and see what it looks like.
Oh, you're gonna make me work. Development Ruby.
I think there's a batch file in there. If you go to samples, you can just double click run.bat.
Son of a bitch, my dog. Get from back there, you little shit! Well, come on. Come on. Good boy. Yes, I know. You're bored. You're bored.
Will you throw this ball? Will you throw this ball?
No, he's one of those dogs that, what's the word I'm looking for? The term for stuck at the hip. God damn it! Get from back there! You keep unplugging my stuff. What was I looking for? Platformer collisions?
And then run.bat.
Yeah, there we go.
You've got an older version of DragonRuby because you should get instructions.
I probably do.
Yeah, so you see this demo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by extension, to answer that question, I was thinking of taking all the samples and creating animated GIFs for all of them, right? And putting them on the page. And instead of giving you the collision APIs up front, I just say collisions, and then you see the sample effort for this.
Let's see, stable collision, so yeah, you're building it out by hand.
Mm-hmm.
There it is. Collision racks, keys, maps. Oh god, I hate that. Aid, multiplies, tile size, blah 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 blah. Define box collisions, quick keys link. Okay, so yeah, building it out by hand.
Yep.
A lot of beginning game developers will not like that. For me,
That's a good question. And this is not the first time I've been asked this question. So think about and I appreciated that you separated collision from physics. And what I hear is, oh, Unity has collisions built in. It's so easy to use. And then they show me the collision that they're doing. And then I say, add a ramp.
yeah.
And what happens?
You got to write code for dealing with slopes.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
They sell, oh, we've got collisions out of the box. And I asked them to do something that's available in Mega Man, like NES Mega Man, a slope, one slope. It's available in Sonic. I want you to show me how you would do a loop to loop of Sonic through his one of his the stage, right? The iconic
Green
going
Hill Zone.
around.
Yeah.
Yep. And that's the answer I get. And then I say, okay, wait, hold on. Can't you use the physics engine? And they're like, well, we can't, because if you let angle be controlled by the physics engine, what happens is that then the rotation kind of like bobs around and you can't really control it. So it's a lie. It's a flat out lie.
Yeah. And one of
And
the
so,
one
and
of the
yeah,
big
so
things,
yes, DragonRuby, you do it manually, but Unity, you do it manually too. Except I have a sample app that shows you how to do it.
yeah. I mean, from a more well-versed developer standpoint, it's fine.
Mhm.
Beginners, it's going to be one of those roadblocks for them because they're going to be like, okay, I'm looking at this sample code. Let me see where's collision. Oh, collision wrecks right here. What?
You copy this code,
Yeah.
just take it.
But then let's say they want to do slopes. I don't think this one handles slopes.
And then the question is there a sample app that handles slopes?
I think that would be this one.
There's a sample app that handles slopes. Yep. There's actually a full-blown game. It's called The Little Probe.
Yeah, there it is.
Yep. And then what happens on the Unity side, what they do is they search for slope collision with Unity, and they find a Stack Overflow post, and they copy and paste it. And they still have no idea what it does.
That is true.
So
And
at least
I'm
I give you a
guilty.
sample app that explains this stuff to you.
Well,
Well, this is one of the advanced ones, but the collision sample app, there's one where it shows you how to do slopes. But you should be able to run this and kind of see like the interesting things that I do with slopes and bouncing and stuff. And you're right, it's all manual. But if the claim is that it is not manual in Unity, that's a false claim. I would say prove it.
I forgot to set sound. I forgot that had sound. Ow. Alright, that was loud in my ear, so it's probably loud for everyone else.
So I think that's the biggest challenge with regards to. Is it still running? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So that's the general challenge, is that the marketing aspect of Unity, they lie to you, and you don't realize that you're going to hit these blocks until you hit them, and then it's too late.
Yeah.
And the very frustrating part is that you people that use Unity, and a big criticism is that they just parrot exactly what you did. And then I asked them, but really, I'm going to ask you the one question, the loaded question that I know the answer to, is that a slope? And it's game over. You know it.
Yeah.
I know it. But the entry level dev doesn't, and I don't know how to communicate that, right?
Yeah. In terms of documentation with this, though, there should be a step-by-step explaining collisions and how to do it. Because that's definitely going to be one of the major things for any game whatsoever. Like handling simple collisions and slopes, like actually detailing what the math is doing and everything, is something
I
that
agree.
should be done.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be a fantastic tutorial.
And I swear to God, if people in the DragonRuby server go, okay, Jessica, write that, I'm gonna cry.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is that like the frustrating part is that I don't know how to address the issue with people are asking me. I mean, I've gotten this question before, right? does DragonRuby have collision in physics? And I go, no, you have to manually do it. I have sample apps that show you how to do that. And they go, well, Unity has it. And I'm like, explain this to me. Explain to me how Unity has collision in physics, but you can't do slopes.
I think the way you're stating it opens up for that sort of rebuttal. One of the big things is say, this is not a Ruby implementation of Unity. It's its own engine that handles things differently. So, with collisions, you have to do it by hand, but it allows for you to control things a lot better.
And then, so playing the devil's advocate, but Unity handles this automatically for me. And it'll be so much less code than what you're writing.
Okay, so if someone were to say that to me, what I would say is, okay, so how would you control a physics object in Unity? Now, a beginner, they won't know that you have to use rigid body. They don't know that they're going to have to use physics
they don't know that,
add force.
Right, and they don't know that the left and right side of a square has to have a material of slippery, right? A slippery type of material. So, you slide down the left and right side.
Yeah.
They don't understand tunneling. They don't understand that. How do you jump through the bottom of a? How do you jump through the bottom of a block, but land on the top?
Yeah, I actually had to write code to do that, and it was not.
Of course,
fun.
I know you did, because I did the same thing.
Oh, it was so not fun to do it. I had so many bugs with it until I got it right.
Exactly. And so the sample apps here, I have one called Metroidvania Collision Detection that lets you, clip through the bottom, but retains the top. Because I knew this was something that you'd want to do. There's another one called Vertical Platformer. You don't have to run it, but it's the same subtlety where you land on a platform that's moving. How do you control the speed of the play? Actually, I'm gonna make you run it now. Just because it's called a vertical platformer, collision underscore vertical platformer underscore jumping inertia. That's it. Number 8.
Jumping inertia. Of course.
Or actually, just do run.bat, not run demo.
Yeah, show and explore. Let's simplify it.
Yep.
Run.bat.
Okay, so left and right in space. So now this platform is moving, but look how it feels.
Yeah, it feels smooth and
so like right, and it builds on the velocity of your movement. So when you move left and right, but if you land on a platform as you're running right, you see that? Do you feel that?
Yeah.
So Unity's collision in physics totally handles this out of the box, right? No code.
No.
Piece of cake, right?
In Unity, I would actually have to write code. Because it's not going to take into account the player position where it's supposed to be according to the moving platform. And if you're using physics, it's going to add force to the player and make it fly off screen.
Right. And so the interesting thing is that even with all the power of Unity, its collision capabilities that are built in and its physics that are built in, you will have more code than what's written in here.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll bet $1,000 on it. Like it's, if you, I don't even know how many lines this is.
I don't remember.
Yeah, if you look, you'll see like it's not even anything. It's one file. Oh, this is the little probe. You're looking at the little probe. Platformer collision, jumping inertia.
I think I closed.
This is platformer collision. I don't think you actually opened the file up.
Probably not. There we go.
Yep.
So
that's all comments.
Yep. So I'm just gonna move that
Yep.
now.
A few comments there. Well,
less than 200 lines. Probably removing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,
12, 13,
12,
14, 15.
So
Yeah, about
around
100. We'll say 150 lines.
155-ish, yeah.
Yep. And so this goes back. What happens? What ends up happening when you get to this point is they say it's just preference, or what of it, right?
Yeah, for me, it's more. I'm looking at it from the perspective of why is that? There we go.
Yeah.
I look at it more from the perspective of okay, so you can do physics, or I
Mhm.
should say collision. You'd have
Yep.
to roll your own physics for it
Yep.
and your own collisions.
Yep.
So that answers the question nicely. Okay,
Yep.
roll my own. I'm not going to
And
go,
then
oh, well, Unity does this, or CryEngine does this, or Unreal does this. It's going to be more, okay, I understand it's a different engine, and the way you handle things are going to be different.
yeah. So how would you handle the reply? I mean, you brought up the reply. I was like, well, Unity has this built in. It pretty much came automatically, which is exactly what they wanted to do, right?
Well, when I
So,
say Unity has it built in, I mean like being able to take existing pre-built physics and utilize it. So, or physics
mhm,
and collision. So, you can do basic side-to-side collisions. You can
okay,
do basic physics with rigid bodies and stuff like that. That's what I'm
right,
referencing. I'm not referencing,
right,
oh, Unity can handle all this out of the box, because I know that's a damn lie.
right. But I think most people that look at Unity and they hear that there's a built-in stage editor and there's a built-in like physics engine and collision thing, they think that they can make Mega Man X by dragging and dropping.
Yeah, I never had that thought. Even when I was a
That's
beginner,
interesting.
I never had that thought because
Okay, that's interesting.
I've religiously played games and I know from growing up playing these different games that different things
Mhm.
happen. Like
Yeah.
with Mega Man, there's the bug where there's slowdown.
Yep.
With Super Mario World, there were some slight slowdowns in some situations, but
Yep.
Mario could run up uh, the pipe with the cape. There's
Mhm.
various different power ups that do different things. So I
Yep.
know that, or I knew back then, that Unity's not going to be able to handle all of that out of the box. Because if it could, then it would just be something like RPG Maker. Like,
Yeah.
okay, it's built for this one specific thing. And the selling point for Unity for me was actually my buddy telling me it's going to be easier than working with X and A.
Yeah.
Like you're going to be able to do more faster. It's going to be easier to learn,
Yeah.
easier to actually start building off of. Like okay,
Yeah. And so the and that's what I found to be most successful for like convincing people to use GDK is by like appealing more to the ethos or like the instead of like the logical objective aspect of tit for tat, this is what it has, this is what it doesn't have kind of thing. My elevator pitch for GDK is if you want to be a gainfully employed game dev working at a shop on someone else's dreams, use Unity
yeah, or Unreal or CryEngine or
or Unreal.
whatever.
If you want to have a fighting chance to build something, deploy it, and be in a community that actually has the same idea of being an indie that can make sustainable income, use DragonRuby.
Yeah, my thought
That's
process
a
when
differentiator.
my thought process when it comes to DragonRuby is
Mhm.
because it's so simple and just how little memory footprint it has. You're not only going to be able to do game development with it, but you can take the aspects from the game development and also
Mhm.
build applications.
And that is exactly the next. And we've talked about it before. I
Yeah,
mean, this is the exact trajectory for it. And the thing is that what I'm hoping is that as time goes on, when someone asks me, does this have collision physics built in? I say, no, it doesn't. You have to manually do it. But there's this awesome platform and website and Discord channel called Game Dev Made Easy that takes you through this entire process.
Right.
And I'd say, and it's subscription based. You have to pay for it, but the guy's really awesome. If you can't afford it, he'll hook you up. But if you're a gainfully employed software dev, then you're going to get to know this guy and you're going to want to support him.
Yeah. Although, considering I use the name Game Dev Made Easy, I have to do all sorts of different game dev.
Which is fine. I mean, I think like just general concepts of collision and like physics, I could say it's not DragonRuby related, but the core concepts are there. And since you're manually implementing it, you have that, and here's some sample apps that kind of show, like here's an animated GIF of a sample app that kind of shows how it works. But the beauty of it is that I give them a very specific answer, saying like, you will find the answer here. You're not going to Stack Overflow trying to copy paste random shit. This is your answer. Go to this guy, be friends with him. He's awesome, and you're going to be part of a community where you're just going to grow as a game dev.
Yeah, and that's actually the goal of Game Dev Made Easy. I actually have
Exactly.
paid for tutorials that go through the entire process of using a single engine of your choice,
Yeah.
where you can learn things.
Yeah,
and it's done in a way that isn't the Unity docs or any of the other documentation.
And that's the competitive advantage we have. We're not a soulless corporation. Like we're human beings, and like the $10, the $5, the hat tip you give is actually going to a real person who actually helped you. And it's not even like there's not even a question. It's like, yeah, I mean, I'm helping. Of course I would support him.
Yeah,
And that's how the sustainability occurs.
And one of the things I'm actually thinking of doing is, after I actually have the Game Dev Made Easy site live,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to make it so that different developers can actually, that I vet, obviously, can go through and create their profiles, set up for their own tutorials and stuff, and sell it. Not just mine, but also theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you empower them to do the tutorials they like. Like, if you don't like what's it called, bullet hell games, but someone else does, of course they're going to make better content, right?
Yeah.
Or more real content. You just want to provide them the means to do it. And I think that's how a company grows, or like an ecosystem grows. Because Unity, like they purchase assets, they acquired whatever that asset was, right? It was like really, really heavily used. What was it? They acquire things that do well in the asset store. They'll just buy them and incorporate it into Unity itself. But the moment that happens, the love is gone, right?
Right.
They don't care about maintaining it and making it like better.
Talking things like Text Mesh Pro.
That was it. Yes, Text Mesh. They purchased it. What happened to it?
It's now a package that you can install in the Unity, but I've never liked it.
Yeah, and the thing is that it's going to stay like that because they just purchased it. They bought the guy out. Who's going to stay there and work on it?
Yeah.
And actually give a shit, right?
And my biggest gripe with Unity Technologies right now is the fact that when they added more to the engine, they stopped caring about performance of the engine. It's like there's no reason why you need the Unity Hub in order to install the engine.
Yeah. And then you get inconsistencies. Why don't masks work with materials? You've added the material feature that has all these capabilities, but I can't apply a mask to something that has a material on it. Because they forgot to, make those things work together.
Yeah. So I definitely get why DragonRuby is as simple as it is.
Yeah. And I have some good ideas on regard to the documentation and how to expand on that. And I love this poll-based approach because I'll hear it multiple times, and then we really dial in on what exactly is needed, and then that's what's added. And then the next iteration of complaints come in, and then I iterate on that.
Yeah. So it looks like we have actually managed to.
I think that's a good stopping point.
Yeah, I think we managed to do the debate on the documentation rather well.
Yeah,
Without
yeah,
us-
and like there were a lot of common points, and I think what we agree on it, and we agree that the documentation is definitely not where it's supposed to be. Um, and there were points where you're like, yes, but I really should know how. I really should have some discoverability on this, and it's like, yeah, like save JSON, save XML. There's no like epiphany to use that stuff. You should just know that those things are available.
Yeah.
So like render targets, it's more of a question of I'd rather the person become comfortable with the existing primitives before introducing that advanced concept. But I think putting it out there and saying like this is available is important. It will be just important to have.
Yeah.
And I think like partitioning it such that these concepts such as like state and state and entities are kind of like either deferred completely off the main page and stuck into like some more sample apps or like some documentation embedded in the zip file, or ease them into it is worth doing too.
Yeah.
So these refinements, I agree with all of them.
Yeah. Excellent. So we have fulfilled the entire premise of the debate.
Yeah, I think we're closer to like that, that truth, right?
Yeah. All right.
So I'm going to iterate on this, and hopefully, like in the next 10 days, the new website will launch, and then, of course, I'll get your feedback, and we'll revisit. And as you come up with tutorials, I can put that on the official website, like showcases that redirect to your stuff, especially DragonRuby related. I mean, it's obvious. Why wouldn't I? And yeah, that's a great way to just grow this ecosystem.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Well, you have a good night. Take care of your pup.
Yep. You have a good night as well, bud.
I always enjoy conversations with you, man. It's great.
Yeah, me too.
All right, bye.
All right, everyone. So the stream has now concluded. Feel free to leave any comments in the comment section below. And if you want to get in contact with me directly, I'm on Twitter at GameDevMadeEasy, or you can contact me in my Discord server, which should be in the description box below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.